Hi and welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah. Today I'm here with 10 top tips for beginner knitters. Hi and welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah. I'm here with Knitting Natter to help you learn to knit the easy way. Yes, let's make knitting easy. And I've got 10 tips for you that's just going to shift you from I can't do this to oh, that feels easier. That's the idea of this video. There are just things about knitting that we don't know because we don't know them. You know that phrase, you don't know what you don't know? That definitely applies here. And if you're thinking that knitting is difficult, maybe you've got nobody to go to sitting right by you on the sofa when you're knitting, going, what am I doing wrong? Then I'm hoping that some of these tips will help you. The first tip is to pick yarn that matches the needles. Now, you will find patterns and designers out there who will pick yarn that desperately does not fit the needles. You'll have really thick yarn with really thin needles and really thin yarn with really thick needles because it just works that way for that particular pattern. But as you're beginning, don't panic too much about it, but find yarn that matches the needles. You can do this by looking on the ball band of the yarn. I've got a whole video that teaches you what to find on the ball band and why it's important. But the simplest thing you can find on the ball band is which needle size is expected for that yarn. For example, if you have a medium weight yarn, you're likely to need size 5 or 6mm needles. If you have something that's more chunky and bulky, what might be called a large yarn or a thick yarn, you will probably need 7, 8 or 9mm needles. And then thinner yarn, you'll need much thinner needles like 3mm or 4mm needles. That means that you find the average needle for that yarn and it will feel so much easier to knit it. You won't have yarn that's difficult to see on really thick needles or really thick yarn that's difficult to manipulate on thin needles. So find that equilibrium between the yarn and the needles and it will feel a lot easier to knit. The next tip is also about needles, and that is to start with bamboo or wood needles. Bamboo and wood has got a little bit of friction to it. It's lighter, it's easier to hold. Then you might find metal needles. Metal needles can be really slippery, so the stitches, once they're on the needle, might slip off more easily, and they can be difficult to hold on while you're making the stitch. Metal needles can also feel quite cold and clammy, as can plastic needles when you're knitting with them. Plastic needles, if your hands are a little bit sweaty, then it can be actually quite uncomfortable to hold them. And plastic needles, they don't hold the stitches quite well either. They can be really slippery as well. So bamboo or wooden needles are the ones I really would suggest for beginners. Okay, the third tip is that if you're knitting from a pattern, read it all the way through before you start knitting. This may seem obvious, because it's the kind of thing that teacher used to tell you when you were going for an exam. Read the exam paper all the way through before you start. So what I'm suggesting is you read it all the way through, because then you'll find out whether there's terms, language, little abbreviations that you don't understand. Maybe there's stuff in there that just looks far too difficult, far too much to contemplate as a beginner knitter. So you say, okay, I'd really love to knit that. I'll set it aside for 3 months, 6 months time. And I'll learn things that will get me there. So you don't have to sit there and try and contemplate this pattern that's so complicated. There's far too much in it that you have to learn all at once. Start with a beginner knitting pattern, an easy knitting pattern, and you'll just get there stage by stage. The fifth tip is to always knit to the end of the row. This, yes, I know a lot of people tell you this maybe, but if you only knit halfway through a row and then you put it down and you don't pick it up for 3 weeks, there's likely to be a kind of a gaping hole in it. You may pick the needle up and start knitting the wrong way, and then your stitches are going to be all uneven, and then there will be a hole in it, most definitely. You may also pick it up and think, where am I? I can't think which part of the pattern I'm knitting because I'm halfway along the row, I'm not sure what I've just done. So knitting all the way to the end of the needle can be a really big thing that you have to learn as a beginner knitter. Just do it. Automatic. Can you answer this question? Let me finish this row first. Can you help me with my homework? Let me finish this row first. Just be aware of that as part of your automatic routine. You're knitting, you need to put your knitting down, finish the row first. All right, we're halfway there. Give me a thumbs up if any of these have resonated with you so far. And let me know in the comments which one you picked up and gone, oh no, I do that all the time. Okay, so number 6 is to find mistake fixing videos, watch them and learn about it all for yourself. If you want to fix mistakes, then being able to do it is a lot better than asking someone else to do it. And guess what? It will also help you not make the mistakes in the first place because you'll know what those possible mistakes are. The simplest ones for beginners are, my knitting feels too tight, my knitting feels too loose on the needles, all the stitches are always falling off, and I've dropped a stitch, why are there too many stitches or why are there too few stitches on my needles? It can be that simple. Go and find those videos, I'll link them down below, and you will find out that those mistakes can actually be avoided because once you know what they are, then you're less likely to make those mistakes. So number 7 is something that I will tell any knitter at any stage of their knitting. I take this advice myself even now. When you're learning new techniques, learn those techniques on small items before you decide to learn them on large items. When I'm learning new stitches, I say I'll knit a bookmark, I'll knit a coaster, I'll knit a dishcloth. It's a small item. It means that I can get used to this and I can understand it first. I can practice it and then I can take that stitch pattern, that technique, that colour knitting, that circular knitting, that cable knitting to then move it into another piece, a larger item. And then it will feel easier. It will say, okay, I've done that before, I can do it now. I can definitely get it right. Because the first time you knit it, you might make a mistake. You might, the yarn might get in a knot. You might get frustrated with it and want to throw it across the room. But you know that it's a sample rather than this desperately expensive yarn that you bought to knit this fabulous jumper for yourself, and all of a sudden it doesn't work. But if you're practicing with a sample, with some spare yarn, you'll find it a lot easier. So as you're a beginner knitter, start knitting small items first, practice your knitting, make sure the tension is right, the stitches aren't too loose, they're not too tight. You're not making stitches from nowhere because that's what beginner knitters do. Go and watch those couple of videos that I just mentioned in the previous tip as well. They will happen. That's part of a beginner knitter's life. So if you're knitting small items, it won't matter so much. You can just start again. Right, the next one. Just take a look at the end of your knitting row. Does it look all loose and ugly? You will find that those end stitches will come to be not a problem at all. There are so many tips on how you can neaten the edges, on how it will look better, but all I say is keep practicing, keep knitting, and as you go, those end stitches, they won't look any different to the stitches on the middle of the row either. That loose stitch at the end of the row is a loose stitch at the end of the row, but once you've knitted it and you're a few rows up, it looks fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Really, just get used to it and say, don't make it loose, don't pull at it, don't think there's something wrong with it. It will be fine, it really will. Now, the next tip is related to that. That loose stitch can sometimes roll around the needle and feel like it's 2 stitches instead of 1. Have you ever done that? Have you ever looked at it and thought, where is it? I'm not quite sure where it is on the needle. Well, take a look at that stitch and make sure that it's sitting on the needle the right way. Then you will see that it's actually 1 stitch, not 2, and you can knit it and everything will go fine. Everything will be hunky-dory. It's just sitting on the needle backwards. That's all it is. Back to front, put it right, make sure you're knitting into the single loop instead of the double loop, and you'll be fine. It really will be fine. Now this next tip, I want you to count the number of stitches on your needle regularly. Maybe at the beginning of every knitting session or at the end of every knitting session. Just sit there and go, right, how many stitches have I got? Don't panic if you have the wrong number. Just let yourself know that you can figure this out. You really can figure this out. And if you're a beginner knitter and you're just starting, maybe you won't ever figure it out and you just laugh at it and go, never mind, stitch count's wrong. I'll figure it out once I'm a better knitter. And these first few things that you knit, they can have holes in them. They can be uneven. They can suddenly have stitches appearing from nowhere. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And you will get used to knitting. Suddenly you will notice after a couple of weeks or even a few days, you never know, that, oh, that's okay. It feels better now. It feels easier. And look at this. It's even. Knitting feels easier. The knitting looks brilliant. Take a look at your needle, count the stitches that are sitting on the needle and just keep track. I need to keep track of how many stitches I've got on my needle as well. It's just something that you do as a knitter. So it's something that I would definitely suggest for beginner knitters as well. Right then, that's all. That's top 10 tips for beginner knitters. Okay, tip number 10, and a really helpful one for when you're starting to knit, is to always take yarn from the centre of the ball. It looks so easy when you look at a ball of yarn and there it is, sitting right at the edge. Yes, let's just take it from the outside. But what you have to remember when you're doing this is that yarn from the inside is easier to manage. If you pull yarn from the outside, then you're going to struggle. It can roll all over the place. Look at that. It can fall on the floor. It can just jump about all over the place. So what you need to do is really just be aware of where the yarn is coming from. Putting it from the centre of the ball is going to be much, much easier when you're knitting. And you'll see that here. There it goes. It's not rolling everywhere. The ball can handle itself. It's not going to get dusty or dirty if it falls on the floor. It's going to sit there on the sofa right there with you. So the other thing you might want to remember is that when you're spinning yarn and when the yarn is rolled into a ball, is that the threads are spun in a certain direction. Now, it doesn't matter so much of the way that it twists, but some will be very subtle with this, but others will be more obvious. That when you are knitting from the inside of the ball of yarn, it's like you're brushing the hair the right way. And other times, if you're knitting from the outside of the ball, then it will feel like you're brushing your hair the wrong way. So just be aware of that. It really is a good habit to get into. It's so much easier to pull yarn from the centre of the ball than to pull yarn from the outside of the ball. Right then. That's all. That's top 10 tips for beginner knitters. I honestly could stand here and give you 100 tips. And at some point I will definitely be back and give you some more. Thank you so much for joining me today. Do subscribe and of course give me a thumbs up if you've liked this video. If you subscribe and click on the bell, then YouTube will let you know whenever there's a new video. I'm here every week, every Tuesday with a new video, and all of this January I will be here with beginner knitting videos. I want to get you started. If your New Year's resolution is to start knitting, if you're suddenly in lockdown and you want to start knitting, then let's get on with it. I'm going to help you with your beginner knitting over the next few weeks. There are so many tutorials that I've got here. What I'm going to do is link the knitting basics for beginners, and I'll also link a couple more of the videos that I mentioned already, just to help you as a beginner knitter. That will get you going and get you started. Do sign up also for the workshop. I've got a free workshop for you on Saturday the 16th of January. That is all about finding confidence as a beginner knitter. Does it feel that it's just not easy yet? It feels too hard? Well, I've got a whole workshop for you. I'm going live, going free. Do go and sign up for that. The link is in the description for that as well. Right, I do hope I'll see you next week. Bye for now. Thanks for joining me. Happy knitting.